The 15 country representatives in the conference room sat in stunned silence as Ibrahim Traoré held up a small mineral sample that had the power to change global energy dynamics forever. "Gentlemen," Traoré said in a calm voice, "this uranium sample was taken from just one of Burkina Faso's mines. There are 127 more like this in our country. Now let's begin the real negotiation." That day, a new chapter opened in Africa's energy diplomacy. The silence in the Geneva International Conference Center was deafening. Representatives from the United States, France, Germany, China, Russia, Canada, Australia, Kazakhstan, Niger, Mali, South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt, and the Democratic Republic of Congo stared at the small, unremarkable piece of rock in Traoré's hand. What they were witnessing would fundamentally alter the global nuclear industry. "You're looking at a sample of uranium ore with a purity level of 4.7%, Traoré continued, his voice steady but commanding. To put this in perspective, most commercial uranium mines operate with or grades of 0.1% to 0.3%. What I hold here is 20 times more concentrated than what powers your nuclear reactors." Dr. Heinrich Müller, Germany's nuclear energy minister, leaned forward skeptically. "President Traoré, with all due respect, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Traoré smiled and nodded to his aide, who activated a large display screen. "Dr. Müller, I appreciate skepticism. That's why we've invited you all here to see the evidence firsthand." The journey to this moment had begun 18 months earlier, when Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former International Atomic Energy Agency inspector, had approached Traoré with disturbing information about Burkina Faso's true uranium potential. "President Traoré," she had said during their first clandestine meeting in a safe house outside Ouagadougou, "what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you view your country's place in the world." Dr. Vasquez had spent 3 years investigating discrepancies in global uranium reporting. Her research revealed that several African nations, including Burkina Faso, possessed vastly larger uranium reserves than publicly acknowledged. The suppression of this information was systematic and deliberate. "Look at these geological surveys," she had explained, spreading documents across the table. "These are the public reports filed by mining companies operating in Burkina Faso. They show minimal uranium deposits, barely worth commercial extraction." She then produced a second set of documents. "These are the confidential surveys from the same companies, obtained through sources within the industry. They reveal uranium reserves worth approximately $300 billion. Traoré had studied the documents carefully. The discrepancy was staggering. According to public records, Burkina Faso possessed modest uranium reserves suitable for small-scale mining operations. The confidential surveys painted a dramatically different picture. One of the world's largest undeveloped uranium deposits, with or concentrations that would make extraction extremely profitable. "Why hide this information?" Traoré had asked. "Control," Dr. Vasquez replied simply. "As long as African nations believe their uranium resources are limited, they'll accept unfavorable terms from international mining consortiums. The real profits flow to foreign companies while host countries receive minimal royalties." Over the following months, Traoré had quietly assembled a team to verify Dr. Vasquez's claims. Using Burkina Faso's own geological survey resources, supplemented by discreet consultations with independent experts from Russia and China, they confirmed the stunning reality. Burkina Faso sat atop uranium reserves that could supply global nuclear energy needs for decades. The breakthrough came when Dr. Amadou Sankara, Burkina Faso's chief geologist and a graduate of Moscow State University, completed the most comprehensive survey in the country's history. His findings exceeded even Dr. Vasquez's estimates. "Mr. President," Dr. Sankara reported during a secure briefing, "we've identified 127 distinct uranium deposits across the country. The total estimated value, at current market prices, is $347 billion. The implications were staggering. Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest nations, was sitting on uranium wealth that exceeded the GDP of most developed countries. But more importantly, these reserves could fundamentally alter global nuclear power dynamics. The geopolitical significance cannot be overstated," explained Dr. Vasquez during a strategy session. "Currently, uranium supply is dominated by Kazakhstan, Canada, and Australia. If Burkina Faso entered the market with these reserves, it could single-handedly reshape nuclear fuel pricing and availability. Traoré understood that this discovery came with enormous risks. Nuclear fuel supplies were considered matters of national security by every major power. Disrupting established supply chains could trigger economic warfare, diplomatic pressure, or worse. "We need allies," he told his inner circle. "This is too big for Burkina Faso to handle alone." The first ally came from an unexpected source. President Mamadou Issoufou of Niger, facing his own challenges with foreign uranium companies, had grown suspicious of the terms his country received from international mining operations. When Traoré shared sanitized versions of his findings, Niger's own investigations revealed similar patterns of reserve underreporting. "They've been doing this across the Sahel," President Issoufou told Traoré during a secure video call. "Mali, Chad, the Central African Republic, all of us have been told our uranium resources are limited while foreign companies extract far more than reported." This revelation led to the formation of what would become known as the African Nuclear Resources Council, ANRC, initially comprising Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Together, these four countries controlled an estimated 40% of the world's uranium reserves. "The power dynamic is about to shift," Traoré told the founding NRC meeting. "For too long, nuclear fuel has been controlled by a handful of developed nations. Today, we change that." Organizing the Geneva summit required months of careful diplomatic preparation. Traoré knew that announcing Burkina Faso's uranium wealth without proper international support would invite immediate intervention from major powers seeking to maintain the status quo. The first challenge was credibility. African nations had long been dismissed in international forums, their claims met with skepticism or condescension. To overcome this, Traoré assembled an unprecedented scientific delegation. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, former head of Japan's Nuclear Regulatory Agency, agreed to serve as an independent validator. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a retired uranium geologist from the Australian National University, provided technical expertise. Dr. Ahmed Hassan from Egypt's Nuclear Research Center represented Arab world interests. "We're not just making claims," Traoré explained to his cabinet. "We're presenting irrefutable scientific evidence backed by internationally recognized experts." The second challenge was security. Several attempts had been made to acquire copies of Burkina Faso's geological surveys through industrial espionage. French intelligence had approached former government officials offering substantial payments for information. American mining companies had submitted unsolicited proposals for preliminary exploration that were clearly fishing expeditions. "They know something has changed," warned Colonel Sankara, Traoré's intelligence chief. "The fact that they're probing so aggressively suggests our security has been partially compromised." In response, Traoré implemented unprecedented information security measures. The complete survey data was stored on air-gapped computers accessible only to 5 people. All communication regarding the summit used quantum-encrypted channels provided by Chinese technology partners. The third challenge was timing. Several major nuclear supply contracts were up for renewal in the coming year. If Burkina Faso could present its case before these negotiations concluded, it could fundamentally alter the terms of global uranium trade. "We have a window of opportunity," explained Dr. Elena Vasquez during a final planning session. "Once existing contracts are renewed, it becomes much harder to disrupt established supply relationships. We need to act while major buyers still have flexibility." The invitation list for the Geneva summit was carefully constructed. Major uranium consumers like the United States, France, Germany, and Japan were included alongside current suppliers like Kazakhstan, Canada, and Australia. African nations with significant uranium potential were invited to demonstrate continental solidarity. "This isn't just about Burkina Faso," Traoré told President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa during a preliminary call. "This is about Africa taking its rightful place in global energy markets." The Swiss International Conference Center in Geneva had hosted countless diplomatic meetings, but none quite like this. As representatives filed into the main conference hall, the tension was palpable. Most attendees had only a vague understanding of why they'd been summoned by the president of a small West African nation. Traoré entered the hall flanked by his scientific delegation and representatives from Niger, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not one country making demands, but a united African bloc asserting its rights. Distinguished colleagues, Traoré began, standing before a podium with the flags of the African Union and Burkina Faso behind him. Thank you for accepting our invitation to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding global nuclear fuel supplies. He gestured to the screen behind him, which displayed a world map showing current uranium mining operations. For decades, the nuclear industry has operated under certain assumptions about resource availability and supply security. Today, we're here to discuss new realities that will reshape these assumptions. The first presentation came from Dr. Tanaka, whose reputation for scientific integrity was unquestioned. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to present findings from the most comprehensive uranium survey ever conducted in West Africa. What we've discovered challenges fundamental assumptions about global uranium reserves. As Dr. Tanaka displayed geological data, survey results, and resource estimates, the mood in the room shifted from polite attention to intense focus. The numbers were undeniable. Burkina Faso alone possessed uranium reserves larger than any single country currently in production. To put this in perspective, Dr. Tanaka continued, the identified reserves in Burkina Faso could supply current global nuclear fuel demand for approximately 15 years. French Nuclear Energy Minister Claude Bertrand leaned over to whisper urgently to his aide. American Energy Secretary Jennifer Collins took notes frantically. The German delegation huddled in whispered consultation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell took the stage next, presenting technical analysis of ore quality and extraction feasibility. What makes these deposits particularly significant is their exceptional grade. Average uranium ore concentrations of 4.2% make these deposits among the richest on Earth. Then came the moment that would define the summit. Traoré stood and walked to the center of the stage, holding the small uranium sample that had been sitting on the table beside him. Colleagues, he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, this sample represents more than just mineral wealth. It represents a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. He held up the small, dark rock, allowing it to catch the light. This uranium ore was extracted from just one of 127 identified deposits across Burkina Faso. Each deposit has been surveyed, analyzed, and verified by independent international experts. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the background hum of air conditioning seemed muted as Traoré continued. For too long, nuclear fuel supplies have been concentrated in a handful of nations. This concentration has allowed artificial scarcity pricing and has given excessive leverage to current suppliers. Today, that changes. Chinese Energy Minister Liu Wei was the first to respond. President Traoré, assuming these figures are accurate, what are you proposing? Minister Liu, what I'm proposing is partnership. Real partnership, based on mutual benefit rather than the exploitative relationships that have characterized resource extraction in Africa for far too long. Traoré returned to the podium and activated another display. These are the terms currently offered to African nations by international mining companies. Typically, host countries receive 2 to 5% royalties on extracted uranium value. Operating expenses, infrastructure costs, and environmental remediation are deducted from already minimal payments. The display showed contract terms from various African uranium mining operations, with host country benefits highlighted in red. The percentages were universally low. Compare this to proposed terms for partnership with the African Nuclear Resources Council. Traoré continued, displaying a new slide. We propose joint ventures with 51% African ownership, 30% revenue sharing for host countries, mandatory local processing requirements, and binding environmental protection standards. The room erupted in murmurs. These terms were unprecedented in the global mining industry. You're essentially demanding to rewrite the rules of international resource extraction, observed Canadian Natural Resources Minister David Thompson. No, Minister Thompson, Traoré replied calmly. We're demanding that the rules finally be fair. The afternoon session of the summit marked a clear turning point in global nuclear diplomacy. As representatives caucused with their capitals, the reality of Africa's newfound leverage became apparent. French President Emmanuel Macron called an emergency meeting of his nuclear policy team. How did we miss reserves of this magnitude? He demanded. France's nuclear power industry, which supplied 70% of the country's electricity, faced potential supply disruption if African nations coordinated their uranium policies. In Washington, President Biden convened the National Security Council. "What are our options for maintaining stable uranium supplies?" he asked. The United States derived 20% of its nuclear fuel from African sources, primarily under favorable long-term contracts that were now in jeopardy. Meanwhile, countries previously excluded from nuclear fuel markets saw opportunity. Indian Prime Minister Modi instructed his energy ministry to immediately open negotiations with the African Nuclear Resources Council. Brazil's President Lula authorized diplomatic overtures to discuss nuclear cooperation agreements. The clearest sign of shifting dynamics came when Kazakhstan's President Tokayev, whose country was the world's largest uranium producer, requested a private meeting with Traoré. President Traoré, Tokayev said during their bilateral discussion, "Kazakhstan has been competing to supply global uranium demand for decades. If Africa enters the market with the volumes you're suggesting, it changes everything." President Tokayev, Traoré replied, "Competition doesn't have to mean conflict. There's room for multiple suppliers in a fair, transparent market." The evening session brought the summit's most dramatic moment. As delegates reassembled, Traoré announced that Niger, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo had completed their own comprehensive uranium surveys with assistance from Burkina Faso's geological team. "The results," he said, "confirm what we suspected. Africa's uranium reserves total approximately $1.2 trillion at current market values." The number sent shockwaves through the hall. If accurate, Africa controlled nearly 60% of the world's economically viable uranium reserves. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak spoke first. "President Traoré, Russia is prepared to offer comprehensive nuclear technology partnerships under the terms you've outlined." Chinese Minister Liu Wei quickly followed. "China commits to $50 billion in nuclear infrastructure investment across African Nuclear Resources Council member states." European Union Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson looked visibly shaken. The European Union requests immediate bilateral negotiations to secure long-term supply agreements under mutually acceptable terms. American Energy Secretary Collins attempted to maintain diplomatic composure. "The United States values its partnerships with African nations and looks forward to constructive discussions about future energy cooperation." The Geneva summit concluded with the signing of the African Nuclear Accords, establishing the African Nuclear Resources Council as the continent's unified voice in global uranium markets. The agreement mandated coordinated pricing, joint infrastructure development, and shared environmental standards. 6 months later, the global nuclear industry had fundamentally transformed. Uranium prices had stabilized at levels that provided substantial revenues to African producers while remaining economically viable for consumers. The artificial scarcity that had characterized the market for decades was replaced by transparent pricing based on true supply and demand dynamics. The most significant change was in Africa itself. Uranium revenues funded massive infrastructure projects across the continent. The University of Nuclear Sciences in Ouagadougou became a world-class research institution. Solar-powered uranium enrichment facilities in Niger provided processed nuclear fuel rather than raw or exports. "What we accomplished in Geneva," Traoré reflected during a speech to the African Union 1 year later, "was more than securing better prices for our resources. We demonstrated that Africa can be a strategic partner, not just a supplier of raw materials." The transformation extended beyond uranium. Inspired by the nuclear sector's success, African nations began coordinating policies for other critical minerals. Lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements became subjects of similar continental strategies. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now serving as the African Nuclear Resources Council's chief technical advisor, established monitoring stations across member countries to ensure extraction activities met international environmental standards. "Wealth without sustainability is just another form of exploitation," she explained. The geopolitical implications continued to unfold. Traditional nuclear powers found themselves negotiating as equals with African nations rather than dictating terms. New partnerships emerged based on mutual benefit rather than historical colonial relationships. Perhaps most importantly, the success of the African Nuclear Resources Council inspired similar resource coordination initiatives in Latin America and Southeast Asia. The era of individual developing nations competing against each other for marginally better terms from developed world buyers was ending. "That small uranium sample I held up in Geneva," Traoré told an interviewer years later, represented more than $300 billion in mineral wealth. But what it really represented was Africa's decision to control its own destiny. The conference room in Geneva, where 15 country representatives had sat in stunned silence, had witnessed the birth of a new era in global resource politics. Africa had found its voice in international markets, and the world was listening. As construction cranes rose above Ouagadougou, powered by electricity from Burkina Faso's first nuclear power plant, children attended schools built with uranium revenues, and families accessed clean water from infrastructure funded by resource wealth that finally stayed on the continent. The promise of that day in Geneva was becoming reality. The $300 billion uranium bomb had exploded not with destruction, but with creation. Creating opportunity, creating prosperity, and creating a future where Africa's vast resource wealth would finally serve Africa's people. Standing in his office overlooking a transformed Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré kept that original uranium sample on his desk as a reminder of what was possible when nations chose cooperation over competition, fairness over exploitation, and unity over division. The small piece of rock had indeed changed the world.